Francesco talk is titled Input-Output Functionalism and Underdetermination Consciousness Science.
Yeah, and let me just add that I was at the University of Bologna until very recently, but I am now at ATR here in Japan. So last minute correction. So first of all, thank you to Keisuke and Katsunori for inviting me. And of course, thank you all, whether you're here or online, for joining us today. So let me start very briefly by saying why I think it's fundamental to have a theory of consciousness. And the reason is, well, very simply, that consciousness, I believe, is already unique in the taxonomy of natural phenomena. As is something that cannot be directly observed by an independent observer, yet is the only thing that we individually have direct access to. So even if I cannot be sure, I hope you can actually hear me, I'm not sure, okay? So even I cannot be sure that other people are conscious in the same way that I am, it's a pretty good inference to assume so. So the problem is, as soon as we move from other kind of system, whether they're biological or artificial, these kind of inference become less and less reliable, right? And so for things like non-human animals, mammal, octopi, bees, all the classic examples that you know better than me, this becomes problematic. So as we move away from the stereotypical adult human brain, if such a thing exists, this inferential power yields progressively diminishing return. So I believe there are two desiderata for as explanada for a theory of consciousness, and one is a theory that is able to discriminate between systems that are conscious versus systems that are not conscious, and the other one is at least a probe into what it's like to be that system. Okay, so now, let me also add a very super quick historical deviation. Let's go for a moment, like when I believe things started to get wrong. And this is in the first half of the 20th century, when behaviorism became like the most influential current within scientific psychology. And there is this quote, which I generally don't understand if it was unironic, but Watson, which was one of the fathers of behaviorism, said once that, talking about consciousness, that it had never been seen, it had never been touched, smelled, tasted, or moved, which I find it very ironic because it's most certainly true, but at the same time, you couldn't be able to do any of those things if you weren't conscious in the first place. So behaviorism essentially considers the mind as a black box, and only concerned with stimulus and response, so something that is extremely objectifiable. Then, by the late 50s, it became clear that the science of the mind doesn't involve directly the mind, is kind of hopeless, and so cognitivism was born as a research program by a joint endeavor of different researchers from many fields, such as psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and so on, where, in fact, the things were kind of turned on its own. And instead of one black box, now we have many black boxes, right? So there is now finally attention to the internal state of the systems, but still they're treated like a bit of black boxes, right? Now, I believe that functionalism, which is very roughly the idea that mental states have a functional role, and more in essence that functions are kind of essential to either to consciousness from an ontological point of view or just to study consciousness. If we move in, functionalism is a very pluralistic kind of approach. But if we move to the extreme of this field, of this mindset, we could say, on the farther extreme, there is input-output functionalism, which I could say that could be summarized as conscious is as conscious does, as probably Forrest Gump would describe it. So, for example, here there is there is a quote from a paper by Cohen and Dennett. This is a very famous paper, Consciousness Cannot Be Separated from Function, where they say that we argue that all theories of consciousness that are not based on function and access are not scientific theories. Through scientific theory, we'll say how functions such as attention, working memory, and decision-making interact and come together to form a conscious experience. So essentially, scientific theory of consciousness that is not based on function is not conceivable for them, and they even present this thought experiment, which is called the perfect experiment, where they imagine like this incredibly advanced surgery that can perfectly isolate the neural correlates of color, for example. So when you present a stimulus like a red apple to a subject, the subject will experience maybe the apple as red, but then won't be able to report it as such. So he will be silent about that. And essentially they use this as a sort of reduction ad absurdum by claiming that any theory that presents in principle dissociation between functions and consciousness is essentially outside the purview of scientific inquiry. Now, a very similar position has been presented and it's been very discussed quite recently in a paper by, sorry, I forgot the citation here, but there's a paper by Doerig and colleagues from 2019. This paper targets causal structure theories of consciousness, but most specifically IIT. And essentially, this is the layout with premise one, science relies on physical measurement. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Premise two, for any recurrent system with an input-output function, exists a feed-forward system that performs the same input-output function, and vice versa. And this is certainly also true. And then premise three, that if two systems perform the same input-output functions, they are not distinguishable through experiments that employ physical measurement other than brain activity. But brain activity is what we are trying to understand in the first place. So if we appeal to that, essentially we're falling into a circular argument. Therefore, their conclusion is that either causal structure theory are false or unscientific. So, because either they will have to claim that two systems are conscious, even though they don't have the same causal structure, or because they simply cannot investigate this thing. But I will skim over my objection. But if you're interested, we can go into that into the Q&A. And I will focus on what I believe is some of the important parts. So, for example, Suchi and colleague claim that the Doerig premise number one actually implies an hidden assumption. And this hidden assumption is what they call methodological behaviorism. So we are silent, or they are silent on the nature of consciousness, but still they employ a methodology which is essentially behavioral. Negro, on the other hand, refined this criticism and claimed that this is indeed input-output functionalism. But the problem of this argument, therefore, is its very limited scope, and also there are serious shortcomings with taking such a radical view on falsifications. So, input-output functionalism implies phenomenal equivalence under functional equivalence. That's essentially the argument that, for example, Doerig and colleague presented, right? Now I challenge you to, that's not an argument nor thought experiment, it's just an intuition puzzle. Now, let's imagine a very sophisticated artificial system that integrates some of the recent marvels of technology, such as Atlas, that can move in an incredible way, even better than a human being, arguably, or at least better than me. ChatGPT that is capable of having very convincing speech, and then something maybe more refined than Sophia, which was this android. Maybe you remember, it's a bit creepy, but can sort of mimic the human movement, facial expression, and so on and so forth. So now the problem is, so essentially we can imagine that if such an artificial system is actually possible, it would probably do as good as most human beings in most experiments that are based on input-output functions, right? And therefore, we are in a sort of impasse, because either we have to assume that this system is conscious itself, or that input-output functionalism doesn't work. And of course, the input-output functionalism in this case could very easily bite the bullet and say, well, I will just consider this system as conscious as well, right? But the problem is that when we move to a more realistic scenario, and scenarios that are not just abstract thought experiment, but are extremely concrete, case of neurological disorder, for example. And again, maybe here we also need a little bit of imagination, or at least the luckily very rare cases when we can imagine a patient, or actually two patients, both completely unresponsive, both completely unable to interact with their environment, right? But we can imagine that one of those patients actually has subjective experience. There is something that is like to be that patient, maybe in a permanent dreamlike state, maybe, we don't know, that's not really relevant for the argument, right? The important thing is that these patients are completely unable to project any sort of output. Now, the input-output functionalist in this case is forced to, because since there is a functional equivalence between the two, which is essentially zero functions, the input-output functionalist is forced to claim that either both are conscious or none are. And this is kind of problematic, as you can see, because again, we are not, again, this is probably a very rare case, but we are not longer in the, philosophically Peruanium, but these are rather serious and important cases. So, and for example, we know that there are cases when subjects are conscious and completely incapable to interact with their environment, as one patient in 1,000 or one or two patients in 1,000 reports that they actually experience the surgery even when under general anesthesia. And if we look at data from insulated forearm techniques, it seems that this percentage can be actually much, much higher. So, and again, this is very problematic because if we consider like there is an estimation that around 38%, which is an enormous number if you think about it, 38% of patients diagnosed with irresponsible wakefulness syndrome are actually patients that are in a minimally conscious state and were misdiagnosed, right? And now, to be fair, in some of those studies, the diagnosis was reverted still based on behavioral evidence, so the revised Glasgow Coma Scale, whether and in the first place the misdiagnosis was due to a consensus clinical diagnosis. So now we can move away a little bit from such a radical position as the one as I described in the beginning, so not a radical input-output functionalism, but a more general and very effective, brilliant paradigm that is still relies heavily on functions, which is the tennis paradigm. And you probably know that this was a kind of revolutionary experiment that Owen and colleagues used to sort of revolutionize the taxonomy of state of consciousness, as they showed that a patient that was previously believed to be in an unresponsive wakefulness syndrome was actually able to answer some questions, some very simple questions, by being inside a fMRI scan and thinking about planning movements in their houses or performing an action such as playing tennis, right? So this is actually something that is, again, I want to stress how fantastic was this and creative this approach, but this also has some serious shortcomings. This, by relying on functions, this paradigm is very susceptible to false negatives, because of course, if your patient passed the interview, so it's able to interact with the experimenter in a coherent way, well, then you can claim that the patient may be actually conscious, maybe actually minimally conscious state. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't really tell you that there is no one there. For example, the patient could be unable to understand language or hear, or for example, could be unable to perform some of those functions that are necessary for the paradigm to work. And also there might be even cases, and I believe it's not that hard to imagine, where a patient that has been for a very long time, as we saw before, there is a very high incidence of misdiagnosis in those cases. A patient in this condition can be in severe depression and therefore simply not interested into participating to the experiment. So all of that is not to downplay the role of functions in general, which I believe they're an essential part of consciousness science, but to be aware that functions per se are not all there is. And when people claim so, I believe that what's actually happening is that proponent of such radical functionalist approach may be affected by a cognitive bias, namely the substitution bias. The substitution bias is when we have when we have a research question that is very hard, is a challenging research question, and we substitute it with a more tractable research question, and most of the time we're not even aware that we're making a substitution. So we think we're addressing one problem, a very difficult one, but in reality we are addressing a simpler problem without realizing that. And if some of you were at the ASSC and attended the panel on functionalism, I think there were some people that proposed that a certain computational functionalist approach may be warranted because they actually make things a little bit easier under a theoretical profile. So I believe that we should be wary of easy, and we should instead investigate what we really care about, which is subjective experiences, the presence of a subject within a physical system. So I believe there are alternatives to that, and namely we can call that a structuralist alternative. I think Matteo before and Qianchen make a very good case to show the richness and the complicacies of subjective experience. So I believe actually that this solution, like, I don't really have an answer on how to tackle this problem in a systematic manner, but I believe that the answer lies between an interplay of behavioral, functional, neural data that are then generalized through, again, investigating the structure of experience, but in any case, always putting experience or subjective experience at the center of our scientific inquiry. And I believe some of you share this view, as we already saw several talks on phenomenology. But again, for example, another way to do so is what IIT is trying to do. And Matteo explained how IIT tackles the content of experience, but very briefly, IIT does, at least as a principle, proof of concept that shows how you could investigate the presence versus the absence of consciousness in a physical system, such as a human brain, and basically would tell you that when there is wakefulness, when you have this set of elements that are interconnected and sort of working together, you have this very complex, massive cause-effect structure that maps into the structure of phenomenal experience. But then you have other physical substrate that, for example, the cerebellum, that we kind of know that is not relevant for conscious experience, that has a more modular, more modular nature, and therefore is not able to specify one massive unified cause-effect structure. And for example, even during sleep, these structures sort of break down and and it fades away as the structure of experience fades away as well. And there are, of course, like it's very difficult how to translate that into a clinical or empirical context, of course. But there have been, there are some attempts. I believe one, a very functional, a very good one has been the PCI, which is a combination of TMS and EEG, that basically was inspired from IIT, from integrated information theory, and aims to find a proxy for integrated information theory in the brain. Now, let me just recap very quickly. So I believe that functions are indeed very important to investigate consciousness scientifically. However, there is more to consciousness than just functions. And I believe that this is the crucial point, actually, the take-home point, that what we care about is not what consciousness does, but what consciousness is. And radical functionalist approaches put insufficient constraints when the stakes are at the highest. So, for example, the scenario that I presented before in clinical context. And also, I believe that when you endorse such radical views, what may actually be happening is some sort of substitution bias that arises due to the difficulty of investigating subjective properties of the experience in an objective manner. And finally, I think, or at least I have a hunch, that structuralist approach to consciousness may represent a valid alternative to this radical functionalist paradigm. And so let me thank you all for your attention and your time. And I think time was over, right? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Questions?
So I have, let's say, no stakes on, functionalism versus structural approaches. I'm going to try and argue that one of your arguments didn't convince me, and I'd like to, engage on that. It could be now, it could be later.
I'll do my best.
So the part where you say, and we could go back to that slide where you had like the drawing of saying the person, say, with minimally cognitive, minimally conscious state, and a person just not giving, say, any output. Well, two people giving no outputs, one having some conscious experience, one not. I'm going to argue that the only way so far we actually know this is true is because we are actually giving an output interface to the person with a minimally conscious state, because we give them the same input and then basically we measure their neural activity, and I will argue that that's the output space. So the only way we are actually able to claim that there is a minimally conscious state is by actually still doing behavioral stuff, input output.
Right. So I believe you are correct to a certain extent, but the problem with input-output functionalists in this very radical view is that they, if you remember the argument by Doerig and colleagues, is, oh my God, I'm running out of battery, so I have to make this very quick. So they actually claim that you cannot look at brain activity because this is what you're looking for in the first place. So otherwise they would sort of claim that this is a circular argument and it's gone. So I believe that you are correct. And this is one more reason to discard this, this radical view. So, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So I think that you're shortchanging Dennett a little bit, because Dennett wasn't a hardcore input-output functionalist. He was, throughout his career, actually arguing about the fact that if consciousness is a biological process, which we know it must be, at least in us, then it must have been selected for, well, then one hypothesis you can endorse is that it does something to the organisms that have it, such that they are selected for in the evolutionary process, right? So that's a different, completely different notion of function as play, because it's not about inputs and outputs, it's rather about biological function, which conveys some kind of adaptive advantage to the organism, and that allows them to, reproduce and to survive and evolve. So I was a little bit curious, what would you say about the kind of biological functionalism? So functionalism, which assumes that because we are biological organisms that have evolved under evolutionary pressures, therefore it's very likely that consciousness bestows some kind of adaptive advantage, because otherwise it would mean that it's basically an epiphenomenon.
Yeah. So I share this view, and actually this is my main objection, or like my first objection to the unfolding argument, that the unfolding argument, as John Mallat put it, can exist maybe in some ideal mathematical world, but not into the real biological world, where you have constraints in terms of energy and space, most importantly. And I believe actually is this the spatial constraints that favors an integrated architecture, which then, for example, IIT believes is necessary for consciousness, right? So to be honest, why I have an immense respect for Dennett, of course, and was one of my inspirations, although I ended up criticizing him. I kind of always had a bit of a hard time in precisely pinpoint his position. So, because I think it changed a lot over time. So, for example, he said something in Consciousness Explained and something to me quite different in the most recent years. So, what I really wanted to do was not to characterize Dennett's position, but just to characterize the position they presented in that paper with Cohen from 2011. So, but thank you for the opportunity to clarify that.
Last question? No? So, thank you.